Welcome everyone to these live internet studies, another weekly round of an hour and a half of two different topics. First segment is eschatology, a biblical study of end time events. That's where we talk about end time prophecy type topics. So stick around, we're going to launch that here in a moment. And then the second topic is about Trinity type discussions. It's called a biblical response to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. Even though right now we're not talking about biblical Trinitarianism, we are still talking about Trinity topics. So stick around for that second segment as well. All right, if you look on your screen right now, this is the topical index of the classes that I've been teaching, and this is an ongoing study. So one video never covers everything. You just have to keep going along. It's like going to church, right? The pastor's on a sermon series. You got to attend every week if you want to hear everything that the pastor has to say. You can't just get everything in one sermon. That's kind of like the way I'm doing. We're in topic 13, Mystery Babylon, discussion part 1, and we just started into this topic last week. So let's just jump right in and pick up where we left off. What I'm working from is a book written by a Christian by the name of Chris White. I'm on his webpage right now, BibleProphecyText.com. And if you, this is linked in the video, by the way. If you go to that page, you can scroll down. You can see there's a book called Mystery Babylon, When Jerusalem Embraces the Antichrist, an exposition of Revelation 17 and 18. And what I did is I created a short essay teaching around this particular book, and that's what we're working from. So basically, we're in week 2 of this particular study. Let me just read through. I created a kind of a script that way I can kind of keep organized and keep you informed of which topics are relevant to the book that I'm referring to, rather than wandering off to side and side. So, and I'll just put kind of visuals later on in the video so you can see kind of neat little pictures of what it might look like, of a description of what I'm talking about. Those of you who are with me in the live class, you can actually see my script, including the little time markers for me to kind of stay on schedule. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Week 2, John's vision of the woman and the beast. Welcome back, everyone. Last week, we laid the foundation for our study of Mystery Babylon. We read Revelation 17 and 18 entirely. I read it out of the NASB, so go back and listen, or read it in your own Bible. And it's best to stick close to the Bible as possible when we're doing a study like this. Obviously, there's going to be speculation here and there, but to the best of our ability, we should just simply let the text speak for itself. And where there are what we might consider ambiguous details, perhaps we can fill in with some speculation, but honestly, we may not know until we get closer to that time period when the Holy Spirit thinks that we need to know, and maybe more clarity will come out of the text. Not that new words will be written, but perhaps the discernment of what the text is saying will be brought to the forefront, and more people will start confirming that this is what the Spirit's showing me. We know that the Spirit is going to be poured out in the last days as we draw closer and closer to the second coming of Yeshua. That's part of prophecy. So we can expect that and anticipate that. So we read Revelation 17 and 18. We looked at the main competing views. Who is Mystery Babylon, right? Many people say Rome. Many people say Mecca. Many people say rebuilt Babylon, right? As in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Or some people even say not Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but Nimrod's Babylon. You know, the first Babylon, the one we read about way back in the book of Genesis. But many people say it's Nebuchadnezzar's one, the Neo-Babylon. But some people also say New York. And we also learned that Chris White, the author that I'm working from, he introduced his own thesis, which is that Mystery Babylon is Jerusalem of the last days. And it's he's being very careful with his wording here. He's not saying that if you look at Jerusalem today, that you should envision that Jerusalem that we're reading about in the news is in fact Mystery Babylon presently. We could say this, in reality, we could say that many of the components that we're going to be examining in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, which kind of starts all the way back in chapter 13 with the beast that rises out of the sea, which itself starts back in previous parts of the Bible, right? We've got descriptions of the Antichrist in the book of Thessalonians. We've got it shows up in Peter. We have it descriptions of end times events in the book of Jude. Of course, I'm working backwards, right? Reverse chronology. We can't ignore what Yeshua gave us in all of it discourses, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We've also got Paul's letter to the Corinthians that talks about resurrection and things like that. But remember that most of the central themes of end time prophecy are actually rooted in the Tanakh. So it's better to actually start way back in the prophecies. I mean, heck, all the way back as far as Genesis, we're going to find prophecies that deal with end times. Book of Deuteronomy pulls something in. We've got lots in the book of Psalms. Predominantly, we have Daniel, and then premier prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel get pulled in, Joel, Micah. So it's necessary to root our theology in the Bible. So when Chris White talks about Jerusalem being the eschatological version of Mystery Babylon, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that prophecy might not be understood until it's actually right in front of us. There are certain world events and pieces that have to be moved into place on this giant chessboard. But what we can also do, I'm taking a little bit of time to set us up for the discussion. It's entirely possible, I believe, and helpful to recognize that some of the major players might already be present on the scene. For instance, geopolitical powers that are moving in the world today. We've got Islam as a major religious entity to deal with that likely plays a major part in end time events. We've got certain political powers in the West. We've got, of course, the European Union of coalition of countries over there, excuse me, that could play a part in moving end times forward in a way that's necessary for the Bible to be fulfilled. America could play a very important part. We're talking about major pieces in the Bible that, for instance, would include, say, Mystery Babylon. That's one part of the end time puzzle. We've also got the beast himself, who's a man and yet also represents a kingdom, right? A power, a geopolitical power in the earth. So that's the beast. We've also got the false prophet. That is a person, but could maybe also be representative of another type of a beast nation, because the false prophet is a second beast himself. Not that he's one of the seven heads or anything, but you understand my point, is that the way the world works is that typically if you have a powerful ruler, he's usually connected to a territory of some sort. He's not just out there on his own like a lone ranger type of ruler. But we also must recognize that there is a system that the beast controls. So it becomes evident that the global power needed for someone such as the Antichrist to take control of the world in the last days could easily coincide with certain political powers that are in control today. Perhaps the United States could play one of those roles unwittingly in a bad way. Maybe partnering with the false prophet in furthering his agenda, which itself is furthering the agenda of the beast and his empire. So these kind of all work together. We know the woman that we're going to be reading about rides the beast. There's a relationship there between the woman, who's a city, and perhaps maybe indicative of a bit of a system as well, not just a city, right? Jerusalem is a religion, but Jerusalem is a place, but it also in the Bible represents a religion. It represents a lifestyle. It represents a partner in God's economy as far as relationship and his family. Jerusalem is pictured as not just a city, but as his bride. Israel is considered his child. So the metaphors sometimes overlap, but at the very least, we can recognize that Jerusalem, or that Mystery Babylon, is described as a city. But it's a city that's riding the beast as in the Antichrist or the beast system, which itself are both described as sitting on many waters, which are described by John as many nations and peoples. So this kind of all goes together, kind of work. It's a one big machine that's moving together to accomplish the goal that Antichrist seeks to set out, which is world domination, subjugation of anything that's other than him. Ultimately, we know he's going to declare himself to be God and subjugate any other gods or things that are worshipped as God. Perhaps he'll syncretize the religions into one, or perhaps he will eliminate every other religion other than the one that he's going to purport. I'm not sure. But let's keep going into our study. Tonight, in week 2, we're going to dive into chapter 1 of Chris White's book and look carefully at John's initial vision of the woman and the beast. I would have to say that this is one of the most detailed and disturbing visions in Revelation. The description of what we're looking at and what we Christians can expect is going to be on the world scene, if not is already being constructed little by little until it culminates in the beast empire, the 7th empire that exists on the world today, which itself will then possibly see the death of that 7th ruler, only to possibly see a resurrection into the 8th. That's a possibility of interpretation when we talk about the Antichrist perhaps receives a mortal wound, and then this resurrection, whether it's real or faked or what, we're not sure. But either way, the text seems to indicate that this resurrection is going to cause the worship of the entire world. Those who are not genuine believers, those whose hearts have already been sealed by the Holy Spirit, will be able to resist this false worship, this abomination of desolation. But the rest of the world will not have an easy time resisting that abominable act. So here's our goal for tonight. We're going to slow down. We're going to read the vision carefully and then trace its connections back, as I mentioned, into the Old Testament and into Jesus' own words about Jerusalem. This is the best way to come up with our speculation or our supposition of who Mystery Babylon could be. I know it's so tempting. Let me interject. It's so tempting to just look at the world news today and say, wow, look at Israel, look at Russia, look at Rome, look at the Vatican, look at the EU, look at the rise of Islam. It's so tempting to look at the current newspaper and begin to draw our inferences about what John was reading in the book of Revelation. But we also have to remember that John is seeing what we could say are, in many cases, he saw the developmental stages of the things that he was describing. He saw the beast kind of rise through the ranks. He saw these kingdoms sort of grow from inception stage to larger and stronger as they defeated previous kingdoms in front of them. Recall Daniel's picture with the statues of the kingdoms and the metals, and as we work from top to bottom, from the head down to the feet, we understand that kingdoms are rising and then being replaced by the next succeeding kingdom, etc., etc. But when we get to John's vision, it's interesting that in many ways he sees the mature version of whatever it is that is representative of what we're going to experience when we get to the last days. So when he sees all 7 heads, he's seeing the mature version of this beast. And when I say mature version, that's where, if you look at today's news headlines and things, we might not be seeing the mature version. And thus, Chris White's thesis can have some traction if we realize that we might need to allow for the scriptures to be pointed towards something that's not yet present. Something that John saw in its maturity, but we are not seeing the full picture. That's why when I look at Jerusalem today, I'm like, no way, they're not Mystery Babylon. I mean, come on, look at them. So by the end of this session, today, whatever, you'll see why White argues so strongly that John's vision points to Jerusalem. Okay, part 1, reading Revelation 17, 1 through 6. Let's go through those specific parts for now. We read this in its entirety last time, but now I'm just going to slow down, like I said, and look at the vision piece by piece. to see what we can glean again. So here's Revelation 17, the first 2 verses out of the NESB. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality." So, by way of bullet points or highlights that we can glean from this text, we see right away that the woman is called a harlot, a prostitute. And we have to locate our definition of prostitute within the biblical use of the word, perhaps maybe even a bit of a specialized use of the word. Harlot here would be a description, and I'll flesh this out a little bit later on, but I'm giving you a sneak preview. If you do a word search on the imagery of harlot in the Bible, it often is referring to spiritual harlotry. So not just the physical harlot who sells her body for money. Although that's the image, that's the physical, that's the natural, that the spiritual can be understood from. But from God's perspective, he's talking about his people who should be faithful, but are in fact being unfaithful. And in God's eyes, this amounts to spiritual harlotry. So we're going to flesh that out. And when we look at that, it begins to help us make some speculation as to who Mystery Babylon might be from the biblical perspective. In other words, it begins to start eliminating the what we could call ungodly nations of the world in general, because they don't seem to be portrayed as expected to be faithful to God at the level that Israel, his chosen people, bride, nation, city, should be faithful to him. So just keep that in mind as we work our way through this particular study. What else does she do from the passage? She sits on many waters. We don't have to guess. I love it when the Bible tells us what it means. John tells us that the waters represent peoples and nations, right? In verse 15 later on down. Right now we're just in verse 1 and 2. But we don't have to guess what the many waters. It also is interesting that she sits on many waters, but she's riding the beast, and the beast comes up out of the sea, and the beast also seems to have a relationship to the water, the many waters. So is she sitting on the waters? Is she sitting on the beast? The beast is sitting on the many waters. Where's the relationship between the woman, the beast, and the waters? And I think it's safe to say at least that obviously if she's a city of preeminence in the final days, that it's going to be necessary for her to have some form of global influence in the geopolitical scene, right? If she's going to be a player, a major player on the chessboard, then she needs to be recognized with some authority at some point in time. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but consider this. Nearly every premillennial rapture position, so we're talking the major 4 that I keep working from, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath. These 4 positions, at least, I can't speak for the amillennialists and the postmillennialists, but at least the premillennials, the historic premillennials, we all have some semblance of agreement that the Jerusalem of the last days will be the place where Antichrist takes his seat in the temple and desecrates that thing, right? Meaning it's not a difficult stretch to picture the Antichrist as a man going into Jerusalem, into something that functions as either a temple or some worship place. I tend to believe that it could either start out as a small tent of meeting type structure, but eventually over the course of the few years that it's standing, it could obviously develop, because the Jews, I think, aren't going to be satisfied with just a tabernacle or tent of meeting. They're going to want a full-blown temple. I mean, they had one before. And there's enough evidence in Scripture that seems to support that we're going to start working towards a temple. Point being, there's no other place on earth where this temple can be built. It must be Jerusalem. So it's not a far stretch for Chris White to say, what if it's apostate Jerusalem that welcomes and embraces this Antichrist figure before he decides to desecrate it. Meaning the role that they play by riding the beast indicates that they are in cooperation with him. And the fact that she sits on many waters indicates that there's some international influence that she enjoys. And so we're going to flesh that out later. What else? Sorry, I almost moved past the final bullet there. She seduces kings and nations into immorality. So we got this spiritual compromise. She's a harlot, but she's a mother of harlots. She's not a mother of all harlots. Don't insert the word all there. But it does describe her as a mother of harlots. And this is consistent with biblical pictures described of cities and their children, meaning the occupants of any particular city are the little harlots, and the city itself is the mama who has her children who are following after the same idolatry and immorality that she is practicing. So if this is Jerusalem, who is the harlot, the eschatological Jerusalem, who we must remind ourselves has played this role so well in the past. Oh yeah, Jerusalem, you are not innocent. You have played the harlot so often in the past that God had to send you into exile and allow your city to be destroyed, allow your temple to be razed. I mean, the two most graphic ones that pop into my mind are the Babylonian exile by Nebuchadnezzar in the 500s BC, and then, of course, the one in 70 AD, which led to the plowing under of Jerusalem in the 130s during the Jewish revolts of the first century. Those two times, Jerusalem was absolutely devastated. So the end time version of her is, we're speculating that this woman, we don't have to speculate that part. We know that she will do these things. We just don't know who she is. But Chris White says, what if it is eschatological, end times apostate Jerusalem? She seduces kings and nations into immorality, spiritual compromise by her lust and infatuation with the Antichrist. Remember, she's riding the beast, right? She has this infatuation. She as a woman prostitute who's also a queen, right? She says, I sit as a queen. She thinks she's found her husband. And her husband's the Antichrist, right? So she's wed to him, and it's her. Later on, we're going to read that her intense lust for him seduces the nations and kings into this immorality and spiritual compromise at the same time. What would that look like? I'm not sure, but we can talk about them. Let's read the next two set of verses, Revelation 17:3 and 4. Again, we read these in their entirety last week. We're just going through them again in our study now because we need to slow down a little bit. Quote, this is NASB again. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. Again, I believe John was looking at a woman in the time when the vision was being played out in front of him. Thus, he wrote what he saw. Yet, we also are certain that these are symbols. The city is a woman. The woman is a city. The beast represents a man, but the beast also is indicative of a system. So, just like he saw the waters represent peoples, right? It's not a sea full of people. So, likewise, then, when we talk about 7 heads and 10 horns and things like that, these are symbols that stand for something else, even though John literally saw the heads and the horns. But it's not that the beast, when he arrives on the scene, he's not going to have 7 heads and 10 horns, right? That wouldn't serve any purpose for God to have some freakish looking thing walking around on planet Earth, 7-headed, 10-horned, thing. Okay, so likewise, the clothing, though, is symbolic, but perhaps it's closer to, as we begin to examine later on, as to try to identify who this woman might be, perhaps it is representative of physical clothing that was worn in the past by people that we already know about, or perhaps it's representative of clothing of people that wear these colors today. In other words, let me just go for the jugular. It's no secret that those who hold to the woman being Israel or Jerusalem specifically, perhaps make the association between the gold and the precious stones and the purple and the scarlet being reminiscent of priestly garments worn by high priests and people in priestly service in ancient Israel. We don't see it today because the priestly cult has been dissolved, but in ancient Israel, the records are still there, and even the garments are being reproduced for the new temple that will be rebuilt one day. So the garments are taken from, the description of the garments is taken from the Tanakh, from the Torah itself, from the passages that are instructive of how to, what these garments should look like. And these descriptions seem to remind us of those garments. At the same time, it's no secret that people who espouse to some form of Catholicism representing the system of the beast or the Mystery Babylon system or something that effect, like a one world religion, they're fond of pointing to Catholicism. So we're talking about a corrupted religion. And if you look at, and I'll flash this in post-production, if you look at cardinals and popes and bishops today, there's quite a lot of gold and quite a lot of purple and red in their ranks. I mean, I know there were other colors too, but they seem to be modeling their clothing after ancient Israel's priests, right, by design, which then puts them in the possible crosshairs of being what John is seeing at this moment. It's also helpful to remember that this is not just something that the reformers imagined, although it would be natural to see that how they would point to apostate Rome or apostate Catholicism as the Mystery Babylon candidate. But keep in mind that even modern Catholics put forth apostate Rome as a candidate, right? Go figure. So let's keep going. Reading the verse we just did, let's look at some of the bullet points associated. The woman rides the beast. She has influence and authority for a time, right? Remember, as we're going to read down later on, eventually the beast and the 10-nation coalition, well, we don't know if they're 10 nations, but the 10 kings, we don't know what they rule over, but they and the beast turn on the woman at some point in time. They hate her, they burn her with fire, they eat up her flesh, and they desecrate her. And could this be eschatological Jerusalem that suffers this fate? We know that Antichrist is going to, like I said, occupy Jerusalem at the midpoint of the week, if our timing is accurate, when he decides, somewhere around then, when he decides to take his seat in the temple and declare himself to be God. The midpoint seems to be the logical, exegetical choice when we consider that Daniel talked about the Antichrist having influence for 42 months, times and half a time, 3.5 years. So the midpoint would naturally be associated there. Plus, there are parts in the book of Revelation, I'll flash this in post-production, that indicate that the 3.5 year mark, the significant 3.5 year mark time frame, it kicks off at the midpoint, which means 3.5 plus 3.5 equals 7. But the woman rises the beast up to that point at least. And then perhaps he attacks her, and we don't know if she suffers a destruction right there at the midpoint, or if, and we know that God is the one making them do this, right? God puts it in his heart to fulfill his purpose because God's ultimately in control. But we don't know if her destruction will be at the midpoint, or perhaps John is describing her destruction at the end of the 70th week, which would coincide with closer to the 7th trumpet time frames, something like that. But either way, the woman rides the beast for a while, so she's got this global influence. So perhaps if it is Jerusalem, that means she will rise in her influence more so than she has today. She's an important city, don't get me wrong. She's always in the news for no matter what she does, right? No, whether right or wrong, she's always in the news. As the old quip goes, most people are innocent until proven guilty, but in the case of of Israel, she's guilty until proven guilty, right? That's just the way the international community views Israel. She's guilty until proven guilty. But so she's in the news no matter what she does. But perhaps maybe in the end times she'll rise in power and in prominence, especially if it's Antichrist who's going to be ruling the world and decides to choose Israel as his capital city from which to launch his religious program before he turns on it at the midpoint of the week. Who knows?